This is the Rif on Beitza Daf Yud Aleph. We start with the Mishnah. Beishamai omrim einot l'nes ha'eli l'katzei v'olav basar. Beishamai say we don't take a pestle to chop meat upon it. Uveis Hillel mativim, and Beis Hillel permit. Beishamai omrim einot l'nes ha'or l'tnei hadorsan. We don't take a hide where it's going to be trod upon, which is one of the stages in making it into a hide, for tanning it. Nor do we lift it up, unless there is flesh upon it. And in the Mishnah in our Gemara, it actually says instead, there's an olive's measure of flesh with it. And Beis Hillel permit. Onto the Gemara, we have Tana taught. V'shavim she'im kitzev alav basar she'atzir l'taltalo. And both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel are alike that if you chop meat on the pestle, it's forbidden to move it, the pestle. We're talking about here from the sun to the shade. But for its own purpose, in other words, using the item for some permitted task, because he needed space, mutar. Is permitted like we established this in Perak Kalkelim. Okay, now analyzing the next part of the Mishnah. So Beis Shammai say you can't place the horde where it's going to be trodden upon. So Tana taught. They're alike. Both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that you can salt flesh on top of that ore for the purpose of roasting it. Abaye said, Loshna ella litzli. They only learned this regarding salting meat for the purpose of roasting it. Which because it doesn't need a lot of salting. Aval l'kedera, but if you're salting it for the purpose of cooking in a pot, which you need to draw out more of the blood, in that case you need to use more salt. It needs more salt. La, you cannot salt on it. Mishum the mashcha b'milcha, because he's going to work the hide. Mashcha is the hide. The milcha with the salt. Okay, so now the Rif digresses to a Yerushalmi, and he provides a specific interpretation of the Yerushalmi, which you might take issue with and give a different interpretation. The Yerushalmi says, Umarim, and you can be tricky, and salt here and salt there until you salt all of it. And what does it mean, all of it? Kilomar, malech al gabe haor. You can salt on top of the hide, which is going to end up working it for the purpose of turning it into tanned hide. Al gabe haor, ma'at kan, a little bit here over the hide here, ma'at kan, a little bit over the hide here. Ad de malach kulei, until he finished salting all of it, and then all of the hide ends up being salted. Now, the thing is that if you look at context, you'll find it's somewhat parallel to something that the Rif is going to cite in the Gemara just in a short while. The context is if you look at our version of the Yerushalmi, so the context is Chavreya b'shem Rav. They say, Melechu Adam Davar Meruba, a person can salt a lot of meat. Even though he's not going to be able to eat much of it, he could still salt a lot of meat. And so then the question is, how do you go about salting all of that meat? So maybe it just means that you can salt as much meat as you want, even though you're not going to end up eating all of it. But Rav Acha b'shem Rav, again citing Rav, seems to give a way in which you can accomplish this. And here's the text which is similar to that which the Rif cited. It's moleachu ma'arim. He salts and he's tricky. He salts and he's tricky. Mlachacha adu mlach kulei. He salts here and he salts there until he salts all of it. Meaning that he's being tricky by salting a little bit of the meat here and then pretending that they're saying that he's going to eat this meat. And then he changes his mind and he decides he wants to salt and thus eat a different piece of meat. And so he could salt here and salt there different pieces of meat until he salts all of it. And we'll see that's similar to something that we have in the Bavli. But the way that the Rif interprets this Yerushalmi, first of all, he only cites that last statement, and he interprets it as salting here over the hide, and here over the hide, so that you end up salting the hide, and all of the hide. But anyway, onto the Gemara, onto the Rif's continuation of the Gemara. No Rabbanan, the sages learnt in a Beitza, Ein molchen es chalabim, ve'ein mahapchen mehem. We don't salt chelav, that's forbidden fats. It's forbidden to eat, but it's okay for other uses, such as to burn and things like that. So, feeding to animals. So, no Rabbanan. Ein molchen et chalavim, ve'ein mahapchen behen. We may not salt chelav, nor may we turn them over to prevent spoilage by drying both sides. Mishum Rabbi Yehoshua Amru, Shotran beruach al gabe seidos. You can suspend them, spread them out over pegs that they're exposed to the air on both sides. Okay, so that's the end of the brisa. Now, Amr of Masna, halacha Rabbi Yehoshua. You paskin like him that you could put it on these pegs. Vika de Amrei, and some say Amr of Masna, ein halacha Rabbi Yehoshua, that we don't paskin like him. V'sugin de alma kalishna basra. In general, in sugyos we paskin like the latter formulation. So the Rif is ruling against Rabbi Yehoshua in this case. Okay, so now we're Beitza Yud Aleph Amid Beis. Amr of Yehuda Amr Shmuel. Molech Adam kama chatichos b'vas achas. One may salt many pieces at once, even though he only needs one. Rav Ada bar Ava Amar, Rav Ada bar Ava says, Marim mlach garma garma. He can be tricky and salt one piece at a time, pretending that he's going to be eating this piece. Which, again, I mentioned the Yerushalmi, this seems exactly parallel to the Yerushalmi. Now, it's interesting, the word Amar is in parentheses, is different girsos. Is it that Rav Ada bar Ava said that somebody should be marim umalach garma garma, or is it that Rav Ada bar Ava, when he salted, would be tricky and would salt one piece at a time? And based on parallels to Yerushalmi, it would seem to be that the word Amar should be there, even though we have it in parentheses here. On to the Mishnah. Beis Shammai omrim ein misalkin es hatrisin biyom tov. Beis Shammai say we don't remove window shutters on Yom Tov for the purpose of displaying the wares on the from the shops, but we may not remove window shutters on Yom Tov. Beis Hillel matirim af lahachzir. Beis Hillel permits even to return them to their place. Jumping a little bit ahead because we're just continuing with the Mishnah. Beis Shammai omrim ein motzian lo asa katan v'lo asa lulav v'lo asa sefer Torah. You can't take any of these three out l'rishus harabim, to a public domain. Beis Hillel matirim, and Beis Hillel permit. Now back to the Gemara. My trisin. What do we mean by trisin? These window shutters. So Amar Ula trisei chanuyot. We're talking about the window shutters of shops. V'davka trisei chanuyot. These are specifically the window shutters of shops. Because they want to put out their spices, their wares, that people can get a hold of them, and thus use these spices on Yom Tov. Because if you don't permit them to return them, to close the shutters, they wouldn't open them in the first place, and then people wouldn't have access to the spices. And will come to hold back from Simchas Yom Tov. Aval, the batei, but those of houses, well, we don't permit them to to return them to B'rishus Ninhu, because they are within his domain. So there's not going to be any fear that somebody is going to steal from him. So Pasach v'lo mimna, and he'll open them, and he won't hold back from opening them for fear that he wouldn't be able to close it later on. And when they have their pivot on the sides, both Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai agree that it's forbidden, and even those of shops. Now, what does it mean that it has its pivot on the side? Imagine here is the shutter, and you have the pivots over here on the top and the bottom on the side of the window shutter. So the way that it opens and closes is like this. V'she'ein lahen tzir kalikar, and if they don't have any pivot whatsoever, everybody agrees that it's permitted, and even of houses. Ki pligi, when do they argue? When they have a pivot in the middle. What does it mean in the middle? Once again, here's the window shutter, and imagine that you have the pivot coming out right here. So if so, the way that it pivots is like this. Beis Shammai hold that we do decree because of the case when you have the pivot on the side. Beis Hillel hold that they don't make such a decree. Next up, Amar Ula. Gimel Dvarim Itiru Sofen Mishum Tchilasan. 3 things they permitted their final action because of their first action. That is, if you don't permit the final action, people won't end up doing that first action, and that would we don't want that. We want them to do that first action. Ve'elu hein, and these are they. Or lifnei hadorsan, putting the hide where people will trod on them, and this is the final act, because if you don't allow this, then people will not shecht animals on Yom Tov, and you'll end up not having Simchas Yom Tov. Bechazeres v'tiyah b'mikdash, replacing a bandage over a wound in the mikdash, because the bandage is going to be a chatzitza. So if a kohen has a wound, so he would have to take off that bandage in order to do the avodah. And if you don't, in general, you don't permit putting the dressing, this bandage back on the wound. But we do permit it in the mikdash, because if you don't, then he's not going to end up taking off the bandage in the first place, and then he wouldn't be able to do the avodah. And also this the closing of these shutters, because of we want them to open the shutters. And that's the end of Beitza Daf Yud Aleph. We're going to resume tomorrow with Beitza Daf Yud Beis.